The store was buzzing with activity. Rows of neatly arranged shelves stood as far as the eye could see, each stacked with everything from high-end electronics to luxury home appliances. Bright overhead lights bathed the floor in a sterile glow, while the steady hum of conversations, the beeping of cash registers, and the occasional squeak of shopping carts created a symphony of retail chaos. It was peak hours at Luxmart, the city's most exclusive department store. Among the well-dressed customers browsing the aisles, a man shuffled in, quietly and almost unnoticed. His clothes were simple, a slightly wrinkled button-up shirt, worn-out slacks, and scuffed shoes that spoke of years of use. A flat cap covered his silver hair, and a gentle smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he looked around. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he was savoring each moment. He didn't carry himself like the store's usual clientele, the ones who strode in with an air of entitlement and credit cards at the ready. From behind the counter, the store manager, Mr. Reynolds, took notice. Immaculately dressed in a sharp navy suit and polished shoes, he stood with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk. A man known for his pride and sharp tongue, Mr. Reynolds was quick to assess people based on appearances. And to him, appearances were everything. As his gaze landed on the elderly man, a flicker of disdain crossed his face. "What's he doing here?" Reynolds muttered under his breath. "Must have gotten lost." Little did he know, this unassuming visitor was about to change his life. A lesson in humility and respect was on its way, one that Mr. Reynolds would never forget. The elderly man moved through the store with a deliberate calmness. His footsteps were soft against the polished tiles, and his eyes sparkled with curiosity as he admired the gleaming displays of the high-end merchandise. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that often goes unnoticed in the hustle of busy lives. His weathered face bore the lines of time, each wrinkle a story of years gone by. Despite his age, there was a sense of warmth about him, as though he carried the weight of wisdom without the burden of arrogance. He paused in front of a glass case displaying an array of luxury wristwatches, some studded with diamonds, others encased in gold. The prices were staggering, but he studied each one with the kind of interest that comes from genuine appreciation rather than an intention to purchase. His simple outfit, a faded button-up shirt, a pair of loose slacks, and well-worn leather shoes, stood in stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. Behind the counter, Mr. Reynolds observed him with an air of suspicion. The store manager, in his mid-40s, prided himself on his sharp eye for real customers. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his slick-back hair and polished demeanor made him look every bit the part of a high-end retail manager. But beneath the professional facade lay a man deeply rooted in judgment and prejudice. To him, customers were either worth his time or not, and he made those determinations in mere seconds. As the elderly man leaned closer to inspect one of the watches, Reynolds approached, his expression already tinged with condescension. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right section?" Reynolds asked, his voice measured but dripping with a subtle disdain. "These are quite exclusive." The elderly man turned, his smile unwavering. "Oh, I'm just admiring the craftsmanship. Beautiful pieces." Reynolds' lips tightened. "Well, let us know if you need anything," he said curtly before turning away. Nearby, a young couple dressed in designer clothes caught Reynolds' attention. His demeanor shifted instantly. "Good afternoon," he greeted them warmly, his tone almost syrupy. "Are you looking for something special today? Perhaps a gift?" The contrast was stark. While Reynolds lavished attention on customers he deemed worthy, the elderly man was left alone, treated as an afterthought. A sales associate who had been observing the interaction glanced at the elderly man with pity, but quickly returned to arranging a display, unwilling to challenge the manager. The other staff, though used to Reynolds' ways, quietly exchanged glances. They had seen this dynamic play out countless times, a quick judgment based on outward appearances. Yet no one dared to question the manager's authority. As the elderly man moved to another section of the store, his gentle demeanor remained unchanged, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the judgment in Reynolds' eyes. He seemed content, as though he had no intention of proving anything to anyone. But Reynolds' dismissive attitude was about to set the stage for a lesson neither he nor the store would soon forget. The elderly man approached the electronics section, his eyes lighting up as he spotted a sleek, state-of-the-art television displayed prominently. It was enormous, with ultra-thin bezels and a price tag that made most customers think twice. Standing before the towering screen, he adjusted his glasses and smiled, appreciating the clarity and vibrant colors. A sales associate nearby hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Before the associate could act, Mr. Reynolds stepped in, his sharp gaze already sizing up the man. "Excuse me," the elderly man began, his tone polite but firm. "I'd like to inquire about this television. Does it come with any extended warranty options?" Reynolds barely suppressed an eye roll. "That's our premium model," he said, his voice deliberately slow, as if explaining to someone incapable of understanding. "It's not cheap." The elderly man nodded patiently, unbothered by the tone. "I see. That's why I'm asking about the warranty. I'd also like to know if delivery and installation are included." Reynolds smirked, glancing over the man's modest clothing. "Delivery and installation, huh?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Then louder, he added, "Sir, this television is over $10,000. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more budget-friendly?" A hush fell over the nearby customers. Some turned to watch the exchange, curiosity and discomfort mingling on their faces. A mother with her teenage son whispered, "That wasn't very professional," while a well-dressed man in a tailored coat raised an eyebrow. The elderly man's smile faltered for a moment, but quickly returned. "Thank you for the suggestion, but I'm interested in this model," he said calmly. Reynolds couldn't hold back a sarcastic chuckle. "Of course you are," he said, shaking his head. "Look, I don't want to waste your time or mine. This isn't the clearance section." The elderly man blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Around him, customers began murmuring, some visibly uncomfortable with the exchange. A young woman whispered to her partner, "That's so rude. Why is he talking to him like that?" Nearby, a kind junior employee stepped forward hesitantly, clearly wanting to intervene but stopping short when Reynolds shot her a warning glance. The manager stood with his arms crossed, his expression smug. The elderly man offered a polite nod and stepped away, his back straight despite the insult. Unbeknownst to Reynolds, the moment he dismissed as insignificant was about to become the turning point of his career and his life. The elderly man, still calm and composed, walked over to another section of the store. This time, he paused at a high-tech massage chair displayed under a soft spotlight. It was an exquisite piece of luxury, complete with advanced features and a hefty price tag. He gently ran his hand over the armrest, appreciating its craftsmanship. "Excuse me," he called softly to a nearby sales associate. "Could you please tell me more about this chair?" Before the associate could respond, Mr. Reynolds appeared, his expression impatient. "You again?" he muttered, barely concealing his irritation. Louder, he added, "Sir, this isn't a showroom for browsing. This chair costs nearly $8,000. It's not exactly meant for casual shoppers." The elderly man raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the tone. "I was simply asking for information. Is there a problem?" Reynolds smirked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Problem? No, sir. But let me save you the trouble. This chair isn't for everyone, if you catch my drift. Maybe you should try something more affordable. We have some recliners on sale in the back." The words hung in the air, sharper than intended. A few customers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. One muttered, "What's his problem?" while another whispered, "That's just disrespectful." The elderly man's smile faded, replaced with a quiet, dignified expression. "I see," he said simply, turning to leave. His calmness only seemed to aggravate Reynolds further. As the elderly man headed for the door, a kind junior employee, Sarah, hurried to catch up. "Sir, please wait," she said, her voice gentle. "I'd be happy to help you with anything you need." Before she could say more, Reynolds stepped in, blocking her path. "Sarah, that's enough," he snapped. "We don't have time to entertain window shoppers." Sarah hesitated, torn between helping the man and obeying her boss. But she started, only for Reynolds to cut her off. "I said enough," he barked. "Go back to your station." The elderly man glanced back, his eyes meeting Sarah's briefly. He offered her a kind smile before walking out the door, his steps measured and steady. Reynolds watched him go, his smirk still intact, entirely unaware of the storm that was about to descend on him. Let me know if this captures the dramatic turning point you envision, or if you'd like further refinements. As the elderly man approached the store's exit, he paused for a moment and turned back. The soft murmur of customers and the background music filled the air, but his movements were deliberate, almost as if he had one last thing to say. Reynolds, standing by the counter, watched him with mild irritation, tapping his polished shoes against the floor impatiently. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. Holding it out, he addressed Sarah, the kind junior employee who had tried to help him earlier. "Young lady," he said gently, "thank you for your kindness. I appreciate your willingness to assist, even when others wouldn't." Sarah, though still nervous under Reynolds' watchful eye, stepped forward and accepted the card. "It was my pleasure, sir," she said softly. "I'm sorry for how—" "Don't be," he interrupted, his warm smile returning. "You've done nothing wrong." He turned briefly to Reynolds, his expression neutral, but his words carrying an understated weight. "Kindness goes a long way," he said simply. "You do well to remember that." Reynolds crossed his arms and scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Sure thing, sir. Have a nice day," he said, his tone thick with sarcasm. The elderly man gave a small nod, tipped his cap, and left the store without another word. As soon as he exited, Reynolds muttered under his breath, "What a waste of time," and returned to his station, dismissing the entire incident as insignificant. Sarah, however, looked down at the card in her hand. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the name embossed in elegant gold lettering, Edward Harrington. She furrowed her brow, the name sounding familiar but not quite clicking. Before she could dwell on it further, the doors to the store swung open again and a tall, well-dressed man in a sharp suit entered. His polished shoes clacked against the floor as he strode purposefully toward the counter. His presence commanded attention, and the chatter in the store quieted. "I'm looking for Mr. Edward Harrington," the man announced, his voice firm and authoritative. "He was just here." Reynolds frowned, his dismissive attitude momentarily faltering. Yeah, he left." "Why?" The man pulled out a tablet and tapped on the screen, flipping it around to display a photo of the elderly man. "Do you mean him?" he asked pointedly. Reynolds nodded, still confused. "Yeah, that's him. What's this about?" The assistant sighed, his expression a mix of exasperation and urgency. "Edward Harrington is the founder and CEO of Harrington Global Enterprises," he said. "One of the wealthiest men in the country and the owner of this entire store chain." A collective gasp rippled through the store. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and even Reynolds' usual smug demeanor shattered. His face turned pale, and his mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. "He visits stores like this unannounced," the assistant continued, his tone sharp, "to evaluate how customers are treated. I hope you made a good impression." Reynolds felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He suddenly remembered every word he had said, and every insult he had hurled, at the man he had so carelessly dismissed. Mr. Reynolds' confident posture crumbled as the assistant's words sank in. His face turned ashen, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Wait," he stammered, his usual cocky tone replaced by one of nervous disbelief. "He owns this store, Harrington Global Enterprises." The assistant folded his arms and stared at Reynolds with an unyielding gaze. "Yes," he said curtly. "Mr. Edward Harrington founded the company 30 years ago. He built this chain from the ground up, emphasizing exceptional customer service and respect for everyone, regardless of how they look or what they wear. Apparently," he added with a sharp edge to his voice, "that message hasn't reached all employees." Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. His thoughts raced back to every condescending remark he had made to the elderly man, each one now feeling like a nail in his career's coffin. The assistant continued, "Mr. Harrington often visits his stores unannounced, precisely to see how staff treat customers. He believes that true character is revealed in how you treat those you think have nothing to offer you." A stunned silence filled the space as other employees and a few nearby customers absorbed the revelation. Sarah, the junior employee who had tried to help the elderly man, stood frozen, her eyes wide. She glanced down at the card in her hand again, realizing she had been speaking to one of the most influential men in the country. Reynolds, on the other hand, was now visibly trembling. "I didn't know," he stuttered. "I mean, he didn't look like—" "Exactly," the assistant interrupted sharply. "He didn't look like someone important, so you dismissed him. You insulted him. Do you realize how badly you've embarrassed the store and yourself?" Reynolds could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, each gaze a mixture of judgment and disbelief. He tried to formulate an excuse, but the assistant raised a hand to stop him. "I'll be reporting this incident directly to Mr. Harrington," the assistant said firmly. "You can expect consequences for your actions. The way you treated him goes against everything this company stands for." The assistant turned to Sarah and gave her a small nod. "Mr. Harrington noticed your efforts to assist him. He'll be pleased to hear there are still employees who understand the importance of kindness and professionalism." As Reynolds stood frozen, the assistant's words echoed in his mind. His career, built on arrogance and appearances, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Reynolds' panic was palpable. His usual composure was replaced with frantic attempts to justify his actions. "Listen," he began, his voice wavering as he looked at the assistant. "I didn't mean anything by it. I thought he was just... well, I didn't know he was Mr. Harrington. If I had known..." The assistant held up a hand, his expression steely. "Stop right there. That's exactly the problem. You shouldn't need to know someone's wealth or status to treat them with respect. It's not just poor judgment, it's outright discrimination." Nearby customers, who had been eavesdropping on the exchange, murmured in agreement. A woman shook her head, muttering, "Unbelievable," while a young man added, "No one deserves to be spoken to like that, no matter who they are." Even Reynolds' own staff, who had long been subjected to his condescending attitude, exchanged glances of quiet satisfaction. Sarah, the junior employee, stood with her arms crossed, her usually timid demeanor replaced with a quiet confidence. Before Reynolds could respond, the store doors swung open, and in walked Edward Harrington, his presence commanding the room. The murmurs quieted as everyone turned to look at him. Reynolds froze, his face a mixture of dread and desperation. Harrington approached with calm, measured steps, his expression kind but firm. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, his voice steady, "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but Harrington held up a hand to stop him. I don't need excuses," he said. "I've been observing your store for weeks, and today confirmed what I suspected. You've built a culture of judgment and arrogance, which goes against everything this company stands for." Reynolds stammered, "Mr. Harrington, I am sorry. I didn't realize—" "That's clear," Harrington interrupted. "The question is, why does someone's appearance dictate how you treat them? A store manager should inspire respect and professionalism, not undermine it." He turned to the staff and customers. "To everyone here," Harrington said, his tone warmer, "I apologize for what you witnessed. Luxmart was founded on the principle that every customer matters. Today, I've seen both the worst and best examples of that principle." Harrington glanced at Sarah and gave her a kind smile. You represent what this company values. Keep up the good work." Turning back to Reynolds, his expression hardened. "As for you, I've decided you'll no longer serve as manager of this store. Consider this a chance to reflect and learn. Your actions today could have cost you more than just your position." Reynolds' face fell as Harrington walked away, leaving him to contemplate the consequences of his actions and the lesson he'd learned the hard way. As Mr. Harrington prepared to leave, the store remained unusually quiet. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, leaving employees and customers alike deep in thought. Reynolds stood near the counter, his shoulders slumped, his usual arrogance stripped away. He looked around, realizing for the first time how his actions had affected not only the customers but his staff as well. Sarah, the junior employee, remained near the elderly man, still holding the card he had given her. Mr. Harrington turned to her with a warm smile. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with genuine kindness, "your actions today exemplify what I built this company on: respect, kindness, and the willingness to help anyone, regardless of how they look." She blushed slightly but managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I just thought it was the right thing to do." Harrington nodded. "And that's exactly why people like you make all the difference. I'll be speaking to upper management about your performance. You've earned recognition and perhaps even a promotion." Her eyes widened in surprise, and a few of her co-workers smiled, clearly proud of her. "Thank you so much, sir," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "That means the world to me." Harrington turned to the gathered crowd, addressing everyone. "Today was a reminder for all of us. It's easy to make judgments based on appearances, but those judgments often blind us to someone's true worth. If we can't treat the people we see every day with dignity, what kind of legacy are we leaving behind?" He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. The smallest act of kindness can create ripples that last far beyond what we see. Remember that. As he moved toward the exit, he stopped briefly beside Reynolds. "This isn't the end for you," Harrington said quietly, "but it's a chance to start over. Treat it wisely." Reynolds nodded, humbled. "Thank you, sir. I will." The elderly man smiled warmly at Sarah once more before stepping outside. The automatic doors slid open, and he walked into the sunlight, his posture steady, his impact on the store undeniable. The staff and customers stood in silence for a moment, the lesson sinking in. It wasn't just about one man or one interaction. It was about the values they carried with them, values that defined who they were and how they treated others. And with that, the day carried on, but the memory of Edward Harrington's visit remained, a story they would tell for years to come. As Edward Harrington stepped out of the store, the late afternoon sun bathed him in a golden glow. The automatic doors slid shut behind him, and the bustling sounds of the city took over. Shoppers passed by, unaware that the modestly dressed man walking toward the curb was a billionaire who owned not just the store he had left, but a vast empire spanning continents. A sleek black limousine waited by the curb, its polished surface gleaming under the sunlight. A uniformed chauffeur quickly stepped out and opened the door, bowing slightly as Harrington approached. Without a hint of arrogance, the elderly man nodded in acknowledgement and entered the car, settling into the plush leather seat. The chauffeur closed the door gently and got behind the wheel. Inside the store, Sarah and the other employees watched through the glass windows, their jaws nearly dropping. Customers exchanged murmurs of astonishment, piecing together the magnitude of what had just happened. Reynolds, standing near the counter, could only stare in stunned silence. The weight of his actions bore heavily on him now, the sight of the limousine a stark reminder of how wrong his assumptions had been. As the limousine began to pull away, Harrington glanced out of the window one last time. His eyes met Sarah's, and he smiled, a small, warm gesture of appreciation. Sarah smiled back, clutching the business card tightly in her hand, knowing this moment would stay with her forever. The car disappeared into the traffic, leaving behind a store full of people who had learned a lesson far greater than the price of any luxury item on the shelves. The camera lingers on Sarah, now standing taller, her expression thoughtful yet proud. A narrator's voice overlays the scene, carrying the story's message. You never know who's watching. In every interaction, treat others with kindness and dignity, because wealth is not in appearances, it's in character. The screen fades to black, but not before the faint hum of the limousine's engine fades into silence, leaving the audience with a sense of both awe and introspection.